This recording serves as an introduction to the skeletal system. You can use this to go along with the material that we're covering in lab. In lab, we're going to be studying the major bones of the skeleton. There's some terms that are going to be used to describe skeletal functions. You do not need to know the definition of these, but being somewhat aware of their meaning will help you identify bone parts. We'll be studying bones of the skeleton, and then on most of the bones, there are bone parts. Bone parts are openings or projections that have a specific function. Right. A condyle is a rounded process that articulates with another bone. We'll be looking at the occipital condyle found on the occipital bone. A fontanelle. A fontanelle is a soft spot that's found on an infant's skull. This is where the sutures have not yet fully formed. Many of the bones have a foramen. The plural of that is foramina, and that's just an opening. It's a passageway for blood vessels, nerves, or ligaments. Again, you're not going to need to have to know what is exactly passing through a particular foramen. But if you come across a structure, for instance, on the occipital bone, and it's a large opening, knowing that foramen means opening might be helpful. Fossa, I don't have that underlined. I just underlined the ones that are most prevalent. But that's like a deep depression, a head. The head is enlargement on the end of the long bone. So we have the head of the femur, head of the humerus. We have one structure we'll study, which is a meatus, and that is a tube-like passageway, such as the external acoustic meatus. Sinuses we've studied before when we looked at the respiratory system. This is a cavity within the bone. On our skulls, we'll be able to see the frontal and sphenoid sinus looking at a mid-sagittal section. Spine is a thorn-like projection. Sulcus is a furrow or groove. We will look at the sutures of the skull. These are immovable joints between cranial bones. A trochanter is a very, very large process. This is the largest projection on any of the bones, and you can see the greater and lesser trochanter on the femur. Tubercle is a small knob-like process. There's a greater and lesser tubercle on the humerus, and a tuberosity is another knob-like process. So anything that's sticking out that's like a knob or a spine, this is generally an attachment for muscles. In lab, we're going to start off looking at the skull. The skull is made up of 22 bones. 8 are cranial bones, 4 are facial bones. We do not look at this really in lab, but we can like to make mention that in the middle ear you have 3 bones. The malleus, the incus, and the stapes. Okay, but we're not going to be covering that in lab. Except for the lower jaw, this is the only movable joint that's found in the skull. The rest of the bones are connected by immovable joints, which are called sutures. The word suture means seam. Let's look at the bones of the cranium. The function of the cranial bones is it encloses, it protects the skull. There are many muscles that are attached to the cranium. The bones of the cranium contain paranasal sinuses. The function of your sinuses is it reduces the weight of the skull, and also it increases your vocal resonance. The frontal bone, right, forms the anterior part of your skull, or typically you would maybe, refer to that like as your forehead. The parietal bones form the roof and sides of the skull, and they're located just behind the frontal bone. The occipital bone forms the back of the skull, and it extends underneath and forms the base of the cranium. The temporal bones articulate with parietal bones, And the best way to remember them is they're kind of around like where your ears are, right? So this forms the sides. It also extends underneath to form part of the base of the skull. The sphenoid bone is a bat-shaped bone that forms the base of the cranium. So the brain, part of the brain would rest on the sphenoid bone. It also forms part of the sides of the skull and portions of the orbit. The ethmoid bone, which is said to look like an iceberg, is located in front of the sphenoid bone. This shows the anterior view of the skull. So if you look into the orbit of the eye, you can see that it's made up of 6 bones. This picture shows the paranasal sinuses. We will be using the APR images to identify the frontal sinus and the sphenoid sinus. The facial skeleton consists of 13 immovable bones and the movable lower jaw. This forms the basic shape of the face and provides sites for muscle attachment that moves the jaw as well as controls facial expressions. When we do the muscles, we'll see that there's also muscle attachments that allow you to shut your eyes, to purse your lips. The maxilla is your upper jaw, and this forms a large portion of the hard palate. The maxilla extends up to the frontal bone, so it forms the floor of the eye orbit. The sides of the nasal cavity. This is where you find your upper teeth. And there's also large maxillary sinuses. So if you ever have a sinus headache and you have pressure beneath your eyes, it's probably inflammation of your maxillary sinuses. The palatine bones are L-shaped bones, and they're located behind the maxilla. This also forms part of the hard palate. Your cheekbones are formed by the zygomatic bone, and this provides the lateral walls of the orbit of the eye. Your lacrimal bones form the medial walls of the orbit. So your nasal bone, right, does not form, that's just the bridge of your nose, does not form parts of the orbit of the eye. It's easy to identify the lateral bones because they have a large opening, which is the nasolateral duct. This is where tears pass from your eyes into your sinus cavity. This is evident if anyone ever cries very hard and then their nose starts to run. There are several bones that form the nasal septum. The nasal septum has cartilage that's attached to it, and the vomer bone forms kind of the inferior portion of the nasal septum. The nasal concha, which we looked at when we did the respiratory system, are scroll or curved shaped bones. A concha means like conch shell, like the shells that you might see at the seashore. And they are supported by mucous membranes. So when you breathe in, the air swirls around this mucous membrane lined nasal concha. It slows down the airflow. It allows the air to be humidified, to be warmed, and it's almost similar like when you have clothes in the dryer, right? As it spins around, there's lint that's released. So the idea here is that any dust or debris hopefully gets trapped in the mucous membranes, does not enter the respiratory system. The mandible or lower jaw, this is where you find your lower teeth. This is showing lateral view of the skull. Okay, the inferior view, and you've noticed that the mandible has been removed, but gives you a good view of the hard palate, which consists of the palatine process of maxilla. So this is the maxilla bone, but is extending to articulate with the palatine bone. So whenever you see of, and then the name of the bone, that's the actual bone name, but the process is what bone it's extending to. So the hard palate is formed by the palatine process of maxilla and the palatine bone. This is a view of the cranial floor. This is where the brain would rest and reside. In fact, the crista galli is an attachment site for the meninges. You can see the sphenoid bone. It kind of looks like a bat. It's forming the cranial base, right? You can also see how the occipital bone and the temporal bones extend from the back and the sides to form part of this cranial floor. Here's a mid-sagittal section of the skull. So we will be using the APR images to look at some of the structures that are found in this view. We do have some real skulls. However, as bones age, they desiccate, they become very dry and very fragile, and many of the structures have broken off. So in this sagittal section, you can note the frontal sinus, the sphenoid sinus, and it gives you a really good idea of the bones that form the nasal septum. So this includes the perpendicular plate of ethmoid, it's kind of the purple-shaped bone, which articulates with the vomer bone, and the vomer bone rests on top of the palatine process of maxilla and the palatine bone. In lab, we'll also look at the infant skull. And the infant skull is not completely developed at the time of birth. There are soft spots or fontanelles, and this is where fibrous membranes connect the cranial bones, right? The sutures have not fused. So fontanelles are these areas of incomplete inframembranous ossification, right? So from lecture, we'll study that there's two types of ossification. This is the formation of bone tissue. The flat bones are formed by membranous sheets, so it's referred to as inframembranous ossification. And these fontanelles serve two functions, right? They allow for bone movement during childbirth. They can kind of overlap each other and compress because an infant's head is the largest part of its body. And then as the brain grows, right, the cranial bones will expand also. The largest fontanelle is the anterior fontanelle, and then there's also a posterior fontanelle. There's the anterolateral fontanelle, or called sphenoid fontanelle. Usually most students find anterolateral easy, so it's anterior but on the side, so it's anterolateral. And then also a posterolateral fontanelle. You can just take the words posterior and lateral, put them together, but you can also call that the mastoid fontanelle. Either set of terms. The vertebral column forms the vertebral axis of the skeleton. So your vertebral column runs from your skull to your pelvis. It helps support the head, the trunk, right? The spinal canal protects the spinal cord. It's composed of bony vertebrae, and these vertebrae are separated by fibrocartilaginous discs, okay, intervertebral discs. The vertebrae are connected together by ligaments. We don't discuss this in class at all, but you can notice that the spinal cord is not straight. It has a number of curves. There's a cervical curvature, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral. And when infants are born, they lack the cervical and lumbar curvature. When they can hold their head up straight, the cervical curvature fully develops, and when they can start to walk, the lumbar curvature starts to develop. Let's look at the vertebrae. There's 7 cervical vertebrae. There's some characteristics that are found in all of them, but the first 2 are very unique. Atlas is the first vertebrae. Remember, the term Atlas refers to the Greek god Atlas who held up the world. So the Atlas or C1 vertebrae supports the head, and it has two depressions or facets that articulate with the occipital condyles of the skull. This allows you to form a joint, or a joint is formed, allows you to nod your head yes. I'm nodding my head yes. Axis, or C2, is the second vertebrae, and this is unique that it has a tooth-like projection that's called the odontoid process or dens, and this forms a pivot joint with the atlas that allows you to shake your head no. This is showing a typical cervical vertebrae, and for the lab practical, you're going to need to be able to identify whether a vertebrae is C1, C2, cervical, thoracic, or lumbar. So what's unique about the cervical vertebrae is that the spinous process, right, the most posterior projection, is split or bifid. Now this is not readily apparent in all vertebrae, but it is a characteristic. To me, the easiest way to identify that this is a cervical vertebrae is to look at the transverse foramen. These are additional openings that are found on either side of the body of the vertebrae. This is a passageway for the vertebral artery. The body of the cervical vertebrae is also much smaller than that of the thoracic or lumbar. This slide just gives you illustration of atlas and axis. Atlas is the only vertebrae that does not have a vertebral body. And remember, axis is the vertebrae that has the projection that sticks up called the dens. Now you'll notice that the bones in this presentation look a little different because they all indicate the hyaline articular cartilage. Okay, hyaline is the type of cartilage, but it's articular cartilage that's found wherever bones articulate together. And the vertebrae do stack together. The thoracic vertebrae, these articulate with their ribs, and these are larger and stronger than the cervical vertebrae because the vertebrae are bearing more weight of the body. So as you proceed down the spinal column, the bodies of the vertebrae become larger and they're able to bear more weight. Okay, this is not the best view for I kind of flipped to the next slide and back, not the kind of the best view for viewing this. When you see them in lab, you'll notice that the spinous process, it points down inferiorly, right? It kind of makes the whole vertebrae look like a giraffe, and that's a really key distinguishing characteristic, right? There's also facets for where the ribs attach, and they just look like little depressions that are found on the body of the vertebrae, right? And also on the transverse process. So the ribs, the head of the rib, and we're just going to identify the rib as a rib, but the end or head of the rib articulates on the costal facets on the body of the vertebrae, then kind of swing back posteriorly to articulate with the costal facets, and then swing anteriorly to articulate with the sternum. It's kind of like a bucket handle. All right, the lumbar vertebrae, these are the largest vertebrae because these support the entire weight of your body. So they're much larger and stronger than the cervical and thoracic. Right? The body of the vertebrae is very massive, and the spinous process is very short, it's blunt, and it only extends straight out. Okay, where the thoracic vertebrae kind of makes like a little curve and dips down inferiorly. Right, so we'll look at the sacrum. This is a triangular shaped bone that consists of 5 like incompletely formed fused vertebrae. The coccyx, also called the tailbone, this is the lowest part of the vertebral column. Typically it consists of 4 fused vertebrae. The average range is 3 to 5. Okay, this is just showing the sacrum and coccyx. The rib cage or thoracic cage consists of the ribs, which articulate with the thoracic vertebrae, extend to the sternum. The ribs do not directly connect to the sternum, but they connect by costal cartilages. Each rib has a costal cartilage attached to the end that articulates with the sternum. The thoracic cage supports the pectoral girdle and upper limbs. It protects your viscera, your internal organs of the thoracic cavity, right, such as the lungs and the heart. Also, your upper abdominal cavity. The lower part of the thoracic cage helps protect the most superior part of your kidneys. And the thoracic cage also plays a role in breathing. If you take a really deep breath, right, your ribs are going to kind of swing down and then upward to expand the volume of your thoracic cavity and along that your ribs. All right, so the ribs can be categorized into groups. There's 12 pairs. There are the true ribs. These are ribs 1 through 7. So these are going to articulate again with the vertebrae, kind of swing around. And then there is costal cartilage that connects them to the sternum. The false ribs are called false because they do not reach the sternum directly. So ribs 8, 9, and 10, right? These are vertebrochondral ribs, which isn't a term that we use in lab, okay, but they're just false ribs, and their cartilage kind of piggybacks onto the cartilage of the 7th rib. Ribs 11 and 12 are floating ribs. They don't have any attachment to the sternum, right? This is something that, I don't know if it's still done. This is done like in the kind of, I think in like 1960s, where models were really, really thin. You remove ribs 11 and 12. It kind of gives you like a, I don't know, makes you look thinner. Well, you're losing your protection to your abdominal organs and part of your kidneys, but right, so you just need to know true, false, and within false, you have 11 and 12 that are floating. Okay, the sternum, this is found on the anterior midline of the thoracic cage. Remember, it's going to articulate with the costal cartilage of the ribs and also with the clavicles. Clavicles are collarbone. Okay, so this is showing a view of the thoracic cage. Right, so you can see ribs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 have the white structure that's shown. That's the costal cartilage that goes directly to the sternum. And then 8, 9, and 10 are piggybacking off the cartilage of number 7. And then 11's down there. It's a little hard to see. 11 and 10 are the floating ribs. Your pectoral girdle or your shoulder girdle makes an incomplete ring, and it supports your upper limbs and is an attachment site for muscles that move your upper limbs. The pectoral girdle consists of 2 scapula, commonly called the shoulder blades, and the 2 clavicles. The clavicles are very thin, elongated, somewhat of an S-shaped to them. So, you know, if you feel where your sternum is, right, they kind of go flat across the upper part of your chest, and then they have to make a turn to be able to articulate with your scapula. Right, so clavicles provide attachment site for muscles that move the upper limbs, chest, back. When we do muscles, one of the muscles that we study is the sternocleidomastoid that originates on the sternum and clavicle, extends to your mastoid process, and allows you to turn your head. We have some other muscles that also are attached to the clavicle, right? So here it's a little hard to see, but the clavicle has the acromion end. This is kind of the straighter end of the clavicle, or you can also refer to it as the sternal end, right? And then it's going to make that little hook turn, kind of gives its S shape to articulate the acromion process of the clavicle. Okay, scapula, commonly referred to as the shoulder blades. These are broad, these are kind of triangular shaped bones, right? And this divides the posterior scapula into unequal portions, is a structure, I read that kind of weird, is a structure known as the spine. So that's a projection. It's kind of like 2/3 of the way up the top of the scapula. Right, so here you see the spine that's kind of separating it into, superior and inferior structure, right? So you can see under like diagram C that the acromion process is where the clavicle is going to articulate. Okay, all of these bone parts we will be going over in lab. This is just to kind of give you like a little bit more background, a little bit more overview of the bones. And I skipped one. I don't know what that does when you're recording. Okay, so your upper limb is the framework for your arm, your forearm, your hand, right? Your fingers, right? And it has roughened areas, projections on it that provide attachments for muscles. The function of the muscles is to be able to move your arm, your hand, your wrist, your fingers. The bones of the upper limb include the humerus, radius, ulna, carpals or wrists, metacarpals or hands, phalanges, your fingers. The humerus is a long bone that extends from your scapula to your elbow, right? It's the only bone in the upper arm. The radius and ulna are located in your forearm. And it articulates proximally with the scapula and distally with the radius and ulna. Okay, again, we will be going over different bone parts of the humerus in lab. Right? The forearm consists of two bones, the radius and ulna. Okay, so if you put your arms in anatomical position, that's with your palms facing forward. The radius is the lateral bone of the forearm. So your radius is on your thumb side, right? So if you're doing like hitchhiker thumb, if you're rotating your hand, rotating your thumb, right, that's due to the movement of the radius. So its articulation with the humerus allows for rotation of your wrists, also moving your forearm. Your ulna is on your pinky side, so that's the medial bone of your forearm. It again extends from the elbow to the wrist, and it articulates with the humerus to form your elbow joint. Okay, the rotation of the radius is also a joint between the radius and the humerus, but it's not part of the elbow joint. So we will go over the bone parts of the radius and ulna. It's kind of just showing them together. The wrist is made up of 8 carpal bones, and you only need to know the term carpal. You don't need to identify all of the wrist bones. They're arranged in 2 rows of 4. The framework of your hand is made of your 5 metacarpal bones, and the phalanges are your fingers. Each finger has 3 phalanges, right? So 3 separate bones that form the joints in your fingers, except for the thumb that just has 2 phalanges. Just picture showing the carpals, metacarpals, phalanges. Next, we'll look at the pelvic girdle. This consists of your two hip bones, okay, which are referred to as coxal bones. Okay, you could also call them pelvic bones. The hip bones articulate with each other anteriorly. That's where 2 pubic bones come together. And posteriorly, excuse me, they articulate with the sacrum. Your pelvis, that term refers to the sacrum, coccyx, and pelvic girdle. The function of the pelvic girdle is it supports the trunk of the body on the lower limbs, provides attachment sites on the lower limbs. It helps protect pelvic organs within it, such as the urinary bladder, the end of the large intestine, okay, many male and female reproductive organs. Right, so this is showing the pelvic girdle. Each coxal bone actually consists of 3 bones. The ilium is the uppermost bone. Usually people refer to that as your hip bone. So if you put your hands on your hips, you're putting them on the ilium. The ischium is the posterior portion. Right? When we do bone parts in lab, the ischial tuberosity is the part that you sit on. It kind of forms like a triangular shaped base. The pubis, this is the anterior bones. And so they articulate together at a joint known as the pubic symphysis. The area where you can see the 3 bones connecting is within the acetabulum. The acetabulum is a cup-like depression that articulates with the head of the femur. Right, so here it shows them kind of color-coded, and you can see most clearly where the articulation is in the acetabulum. This is really more obvious on a real coxal bones, like such as the real skeleton. The synthetic bones really do not give you a great idea of where they articulate together, and this is something you don't need to worry about for lab, because we're just going to identify the acetabulum as being the cavity where the femur attaches. This slide's just comparing male and female pelvises, right? This isn't anything that you need to worry about on the lab or lecture exam, but you can see some differences in the width of the pubic arch. Okay, so you have the female pelvis, excuse me, diagram A, the male pelvis, diagram B, right? The ilium in the female pelvis is more flared, right? The ischial spine, it's not really obvious here, but there is a much wider difference between the ischial spines in the female pelvis. Also, the sacrum's a little bit more curved inward on the male pelvis. And all of these like adaptations or differences are to allow delivery of a baby. Yeah, so this is just kind of showing the differences in the pelvic girdle, right? The pubic arch is wider. In the whole pelvic cavity, the female is wider in all diameters. Shorter, it's roomier, it's less funnel shaped, just much broader, right? Sacrum, females is wider, and the curvature, remember the curvature is not as sharp as a male, right? Male sacrum kind of curves inward, and the female coccyx is more movable than that of a male. So, I mean, this is like very common during childbirth that the woman actually breaks the coccyx. Okay, let's look at the bones of the lower limb. So we have the femur, tibia, fibula, patella, ankle, tarsals, foot, metatarsals. Phalanges is also the term referring to the toes. The femur is also called the thigh bone. This extends from the hip to the knee. This is the largest bone in the body. And the head, again, is going to fit into the acetabulum of the hip bone. It also articulates with the tibia. And this is at the area of the medial lateral condyles. The patella, or kneecap, articulates with the femur at the distal anterior surface, and it's situated in the quadriceps femoris tendon. Right, so this is showing the femur. You can see the condyles located at the bottom of the bone. It also shows the patellar surface. We don't identify that in lab. Excuse me. Tibia is also referred to as a shin bone. This is the weight-bearing bone of the lower leg. Right? It's the larger of the lower leg bones, and it's found on the medial, or you can think of like your big toe side. So it also has a medial and lateral condyle, and that's what's going to articulate with the femur. And it also articulates distally with the talus of the ankle. Right, so the ankle joint consists of the talus, the tibia, and the fibula. Note that ankle joint is a little different than the ankle bones. Okay, all right. It has an anterior tuberosity, and that's attachment of the patellar ligament, and that's continued with the patellar tendon. Right. Other features include the medial malleolus. That's like the little round ball found in your inner ankle. The fibula is like a really nondescript bone. It doesn't have any real standout anatomical features. It's just very long and slender. Does not bear any of your body weight. It kind of acts as a brace. It's not part of your knee joint. It has a head, and then it has a distal lateral malleolus, so you can feel like a round ball on your outer ankle. This image shows, you can see the lateral and medial malleolus, and they're going to articulate with the talus. Okay, so your tarsal bones are your ankle bones, and there's 7 tarsal bones. The talus is one of the tarsal bones that articulates with the tibia and fibula. Again, that forms your ankle joint. Your heel bone is called your calcaneus. That helps support the weight of your body. Okay, your metatarsals are the 5 foot bones. The distal heads form the ball of the foot. Don't have to worry about that. Also forms the arch of the foot. Your toes, very similar to the fingers, there's 3 phalanges. The exception is your big toe or your great toe that just has 2 phalanges. Right? So here you can see the calcaneus. We're going to identify that bone. Right? The talus extends up superiorly and articulates with the tibia and the fibula. And lastly, we have a superior view of the foot.